The shutter clicked at exactly 2:06 p.m. on March 3rd, 1874. The photographer, Edwin Barrow, lowered the bellows camera with a furrowed brow. He didn't say anything at first, only adjusted the lens cap and stepped back slowly, boots sinking lightly into the soft, cold earth near Fairhollow Creek. The field around him was quiet except for the distant call of a crow and the gentle hiss of wind through brittle reeds. Before him stood a man. Still, upright, alone. The man wore a dark overcoat, neatly buttoned up to the neck, and held a wide-brimmed hat loosely in one gloved hand. He didn't blink, didn't speak. His face was expressionless, though not empty. There was something unreadable in his gaze, a kind of suspended focus that gave Barrow pause. His eyes, pale and sharp under the shade of his brow, were fixed not on the camera, but just past it, into the distance, as if watching something slowly approaching. Barrow adjusted his stance, uneasy. "Sir," he tried, clearing his throat, "would you mind stepping back a pace? You're right on the edge of the frame." The man gave no reply. His chest moved gently with breath, but nothing else. There was no reaction, no sign he'd even heard the request. For a long, awkward moment, Barrow hesitated. He glanced toward the tree line behind the figure, where the late winter woods grew tangled and dark, branches clawing into the open sky. Then he looked down. That's when he saw the footprints. 6 muddy impressions stretched from the trees to the man, wide, deep, unmistakably fresh. But there were none behind him. Not one. The ground directly behind the man's boots was untouched. The grass there, pale, dry, flattened in spots from the long season, showed no sign of disturbance. No trail led to him. Only 2. Barrow frowned, knelt carefully beside the tripod, and leaned closer. The field had been damp that morning from the mist rolling off the creek, and the soft earth had held every print they'd made on the way in. Yet, somehow, this man's path ended at his own feet, as if he'd been placed there, or worse, as if he had stepped out of somewhere else. Barrow stood slowly, breath misting in the cold air. He glanced back toward his assistant, Samuel Garnell, who stood several yards away near a surveyor's rod. Garnell was scribbling something in his notebook, unaware of the tension beginning to coil around the edges of the frame. Barrow looked again at the man. "Sir," he said, firmer this time, "may I ask your name?" The man tilted his head slightly, barely perceptible. His lips parted, not in speech, but in the beginning of a breath. Barrow's heart gave a small thud. He stepped forward, then stopped. The air around the man felt different, thicker, charged. He couldn't explain it, but the hairs along his forearm prickled beneath his coat. The silence had grown too heavy, the wind too still, and somewhere nearby the crow had gone quiet. Something was wrong. Barrow swallowed and turned to Garnell. "Do you know this fellow?" he called out. Garnell looked up, annoyed. "What fellow?" Barrow pointed directly at the man. Garnell's face changed. He dropped his notebook. There was a beat, then 2, before Garnell walked quickly toward Barrow, boots crunching. "I thought you were taking a landscape," he said sharply, eyes locked on the figure ahead. "Who the hell is that?" "You didn't see him walk up?" Barrow asked, voice low. Garnell shook his head. "There's no one but us." Barrow stepped aside, gesturing with both hands. "He's right there." But Garnell didn't answer. He just stood frozen, mouth slightly open, staring at the man in the coat whose gaze had never shifted, whose hat remained limp in his fingers, whose boots sat motionless on grass that had not bent beneath him. Garnell took a step back. "I don't like this," he muttered. "I don't like this one bit." Barrow nodded slowly, more to himself than anyone else. "Let's just finish and go," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I've already exposed the plate." The man didn't react. He simply stood, as if waiting. They packed in silence, neither man willing to speak further. Barrow didn't take his eyes off the figure until the last moment, when he wrapped the camera in its cloth and strapped it to the wooden cart. By the time they turned back to where the man had been, the field was empty. Gone. No sound, no movement, just 6 muddy footprints trailing from the forest and ending in grass that had never been touched. 15 miles away that same night, a telegraph operator at the Ellenton station reported a minor tremor in the lines. Just a flicker, he said, like a wire pulled too tight by the air itself. It didn't make the papers, but years later, when the glass plate resurfaced, misfiled in a box of railway surveys by a clerk who'd long since retired, it would make something else entirely. The analysts at the Glassford Historical Society enlarged the image. They tested the emulsion, cross-checked the camera model, verified the plate integrity. No signs of retouching, no double exposure, no light bleed or shadow doubling. Only the man. Only the trail that led to him. Only the absence of where he'd come from. This is where the known record ends, and the questions begin. March 3rd, 1874. Ellenton, Maine. The children found him first. Just after noon, as the school bell echoed across the edge of Fairhollow Creek, 3 boys ran off the main path toward the cemetery woods, chasing a squirrel, or perhaps just a dare. Their boots kicked up damp earth as they tore through the underbrush, laughter rising in bursts until one of them, Samuel Clay, age 11, skidded to a stop. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He simply pointed. There, just beyond the southern fence of the old Whitlock Cemetery, stood a man. He wasn't moving. His coat, dark wool and tightly buttoned, looked dry despite the morning mist. He held a wide-brimmed hat in one hand, pressed against his chest, and his eyes, at least from the boy's distance, seemed glassy, almost too still. But what froze the children wasn't the man's expression. It was his stillness. He didn't twitch, didn't breathe, didn't seem aware of them at all. "He looks like he's waiting for something," murmured Samuel, voice barely audible. The other 2 boys, Edwin and Thomas, peered from behind the trees. "Maybe he's a mourner," Edwin said. "Lost someone." "In the south field," Thomas scoffed. "There ain't no graves out there." They stood in silence, the wind brushing dry pine needles across their boots. Then the man's head turned, slowly, mechanically. He didn't look at them. He looked past them, toward the tree line, as if expecting someone else. The 3 boys bolted, crashing through the brush with the breathless panic only children know. By the time they reached the schoolyard and told their teacher, the man was gone. But his presence lingered. That evening, Dr. Wilbert Mears was summoned to the Clay household. Samuel had developed a sudden fever. No cough, no rash, no clear cause. The boy mumbled in his sleep, tossing under sweat-drenched sheets, repeating the same phrase over and over. "He's not from here. His eyes. His eyes." Dr. Mears, a stout man with thick spectacles and a surgeon's hands, scribbled the episode into his ledger. But he didn't write fever. Instead, he noted, "A stranger with the eyes of a fevered bird." The next morning, he visited the cemetery alone. Mears walked the south field carefully, boots sinking slightly in the thawed mud. The sun hung low, spilling light through the skeletal trees. He saw no one, only the fence, the brittle grass, and 6 distinct footprints trailing in from the woods. They stopped at the center of the field. There were none behind them. The physician crouched down, tracing one print with a gloved finger. The impressions were too sharp to be old, too perfect to be mistaken for animal. But there was something off. No heel sink, as if the figure had pressed down without weight. He stood slowly, gaze unsettled, and without a word returned to his office. That evening, he canceled all appointments and didn't leave his home for 3 days. Over at St. Bartholomew's Parish, Father Leland Tomes sat in his study, quills scratching across parchment. He paused only once, brow furrowed, before jotting down a terse footnote in the parish log. March 3rd. A man outside the cemetery fence, unmoving. He did not elaborate. That Sunday, the pews were half empty. The children refused to walk past the cemetery path. One boy burst into tears when asked to take the south route home. Dogs began barking at night, facing the field with hackles raised, growling at something no man could see. Then came the fog. A thick, creeping shroud that rolled in without wind or storm. It came low, hugging the south field, spilling over the fence like breath from an open grave. By Wednesday morning, parish caretaker Elias Hemley discovered the churchyard, marigolds blackened and shriveled. "Fungus," claimed the constable. "Swamp mist from the lowland marshes." But the fog never touched the marshes. It stayed at the cemetery's edge, roiling like it waited for something. On the 10th of March, Father Tomes recorded another note, nearly illegible from the haste of his pen. The fog returned. The children won't go near the south field. He asked Elias to seal the chapel's east doors. That week, no visitors came to Sunday service. By then, no one remembered the man's face, only the way he stood, only the unnatural calm, the too still hands, the forward-tilted shadow. No name was ever given. No one in Ellenton claimed to know him, and the photo, developed weeks later in a dark room miles away, would show no fog, no illness, no decay, only footprints, only a man standing where no path led. But the photo shows no fog, no swamp, no illness, only arrival without origin. The shutter clicked at 2:06 p.m. sharp. Edwin Barrow lowered the heavy Melgrave No. 2 bellows camera and adjusted the leather strap on his shoulder, exhaling a slow breath into the stillness. The light had held steady all afternoon. Cloudless sky, no wind, nothing to distort the long exposure. Just a man standing in the open field, motionless. He glanced toward Surveyor Garnell, who stood a few paces back near a weathered boundary marker. Garnell didn't speak. His brow was furrowed, arms folded, fingers twitching at the sleeve of his wool coat as if something unsettled him. Barrow looked back at the man he had just photographed. The figure still hadn't moved. He was young, or perhaps just ageless in that eerie, unblinking way. Coat buttoned all the way up despite the mild day. One hand cradled a wide-brimmed hat against his thigh, fingers pale and still. But it was his eyes, shut completely, as if resisting the world that gnawed at Barrow. They hadn't so much blinked during the entire setup. He stepped closer, trying not to crunch the grass, but the silence of the field only made his footsteps feel louder. He looked down. There were 6 muddy footprints in the soft earth, perfectly spaced, leading from the tree line. But there were none behind the man. Barrow frowned. He leaned in. The soil where the man now stood was untouched. No depression, no crushed grass, no displaced clumps of earth. It was as if the man had not walked to the position, but simply appeared. "Mr. Garnell?" Barrow called softly without turning. Garnell approached slowly, hesitant. His eyes darted between the camera and the figure in the field. Barrow gestured toward the ground. "His trail ends here. It doesn't, look." Garnell didn't bend down to examine. He stayed back, his voice brittle. "He wasn't part of our group." Barrow turned, startled. "What do you mean?" "I brought you here to photograph the boundary post," Garnell said, pointing, "to file for county records. There were 3 of us, myself, Delbridge, and the assistant from Lorne. That man." He shook his head, backing a step away. "He wasn't with us when we arrived. I never saw him come up the path." Barrow felt a strange chill rise in his chest. "But he was standing there when we set the plate." Garnell swallowed hard. "He wasn't there before." There was a silence then, deep and thick like wool, the kind that made sound seem sacrilegious. Without another word, Garnell turned and walked away, boots brushing dry grass, leaving Barrow alone with the figure once more. Barrow took one last look at the unmoving man before packing up the equipment with shaking fingers. He developed the plate that night in his shed behind the darkroom. The image came through crisp and clean, the exposure perfect. But the detail disturbed him more in stillness than in life. The man's position was symmetrical to the frame, the posture natural, too natural. But the shadows told a different story. The man's own shadow fell cleanly to the west, matching the hour and the sun's position. But the footprints trailing toward him had none. They cast no shadows at all. Barrow's journal entry that night was hurried, scratched into the margins of an older page. Developed a plate today, subject's feet did not match his trail. Mr. Garnell disturbed. He returned to it days later, scribbling another line in deeper ink. I dream of the man often. He does not blink. In the weeks that followed, Barrow attempted to contact the Lorne assistant to verify if the figure had spoken, moved, or even acknowledged the surveyors. No reply came. Garnell, when pressed, refused to speak of the event again, his tone growing cold and clipped. He never claimed the photograph, didn't want it tied to his report, didn't want it in his house. Barrow, left with the glass plate, kept it wrapped in cloth beneath his desk. He did not hang it with the others. His wife, Alma, found it after his death in 1889. She never sold it, never displayed it, but once described it in a letter as an image that watches you without looking. No one knew what she meant. Eventually, after her passing, the plate vanished, misfiled, misplaced, maybe intentionally hidden. It would not surface again for more than a century. The plate passed to Barrow's widow, then vanished for over a century. The envelope was brittle with age, its edges crumbling like dried leaves as the archivist eased it from between two mold-flecked census ledgers in the Bartram County Museum's sub-basement. The year was 1891. The label, handwritten in thick, fading ink, read simply, Barrow, glass negative, unclaimed. Harold Trent, the assistant archivist on rotation that month, squinted at the seal, a wax imprint pressed without a crest or mark, smeared slightly as if applied in haste. He tilted the envelope toward the narrow shaft of daylight coming through the basement window. Dust danced through the beam like suspended ash. Behind him, the ticking of a wall-mounted pendulum clock seemed louder than it should have. He did not open the envelope. Not then. It wasn't until a week later, in the silence of a Monday afternoon, that the envelope was carefully sliced open and catalogued. Inside were 3 items: a glass plate negative, still intact in its paper sleeve, a handwritten catalog card, dated April 2nd, 1874, unsigned, and a folded sheet, sealed with the same type of wax. The note was brief. 1 sentence, printed in tight, deliberate script. Do not exhibit. Orientation uncertain. Figure's presence does not match ingress. Trent furrowed his brow. The phrasing was clinical, yet vague, scientific, but afraid. He resealed the note and wrote in his log, "Will defer to senior staff." By the time it reached Professor Ellery Vance, 13 years had passed. Hawthorne Technical College had built its reputation on optical engineering, and Vance, one of its few tenured professors, was known for his obsession with early photographic anomalies. He had requested access to the Barrow negative after reading a footnote in a discontinued museum inventory, and the museum obliged, more eager to be rid of it than curious to know more. The plate was placed on his viewing table under sterile white light. Vance adjusted his spectacles and pulled a long prism loop from its velvet casing, followed by a silver nitrate filter stored in a lead-tipped vial. He approached the image like a surgeon. At first glance, the composition held nothing remarkable. A man, alone in a field. But Vance's trained eye went straight to the footprints. He muttered under his breath. No disturbance in the grass. Yet impact is visible, he said, his voice a whisper against the cold glass. He leaned in, filter aligned. Through the silver nitrate lens, the emulsion reacted differently. The figure, the man in the coat, refracted cleanly. His edges broke light like any tangible subject, but the ground beneath him did not. The blades of grass, the earth at his feet, the supposed trail from the woods, it held a flatness that defied known geometry. Vance recorded his findings in a letter to the museum's scientific committee. The figure refracts with proper light incidence. The ground does not. This is not a fabrication, but a conflict of geometry. He signed his name, then folded the note and left it in the Barrow file. He never wrote of it again, nor, reportedly, did he speak of it in lectures. But his final entry in the college's private logbook read only, "Some photographs reveal what we did see. Others, what we never should have." The negative remained shelved for years, forgotten again. It wasn't until 1920 that Merrill Grost, a young chemist from the Franklin Institute, rediscovered the plate during an audit of unprocessed records. Grost was not a photographer by trade but specialized in pressure imprint analysis, studying how mass interacts with material substrates. His interest was simple: determine whether the footprints in the image indicated the weight of the figure standing above them. Using a spectrograph and density ruler, Grost spent 3 weeks analyzing the plate under controlled conditions. On the 4th, he penned a concise, almost nervous report. Depth suggests a 90-kilogram adult male, but no heel sink, no distortion at ball or toe. As if the ground was warned, he paused on that last word. Warned. Not prepared, not compressed. Warned. As though the earth beneath the man's feet had anticipated his weight before it ever arrived. He sent the report, unsigned, to the Bartram archive with a note stapled to the back. "I do not require acknowledgement." There would be no further study until decades later. But by then, the narrative had shifted, transformed from a curiosity into a caution. The photograph began to move only in whispers, its file name often left unspoken, its record marked with a single phrase printed in red across multiple catalog entries. Every expert clarified the image, none could clarify the moment. The boot prints were exact. Not close, not similar, exact. Inspector Lyle Vernine stood with his arms crossed, breath rising in small clouds as he examined the glass plate again under the museum's reproduction light. It was 1912, decades after the photograph was first taken, but the unease hadn't faded. If anything, it deepened the more eyes reviewed it. Vernine had been brought in by the Ellenton Historical Committee not because he was a believer in strange tales, but precisely because he wasn't. He had a reputation: firm, logical, methodical. He set the magnifying loupe down and rubbed his temple. "The spacing's too perfect," he muttered. 6 prints, each aligned, depth even. Angle of approach matches the subject's final stance, but no indication he turned. Behind him, Jonathan Crestwell, a nervous young assistant with ink-stained cuffs, leaned closer. Could he have backed into position? Vernon turned slowly, fixing him with a sharp look. You ever try walking backwards into the mud without breaking stride or losing depth uniformity? Because that's what this would take, Crestwell swallowed hard, eyes darting back to the plate. Could the image be a double exposure? Vernon stepped aside, gesturing toward the surrounding photographic samples on the table. Barrow's other plates show no flaws, no ghosting, no layering. Even his misfires follow technical logic. This isn't a mistake. This is intentional somehow. But by whom and how, no one seems to know. Outside, a crow cawed from the snow-dusted elm near the library's western alcove. Its cry was distant, but sharp, like a bell cracked mid-ring. By then, 3 theories had gained traction, though none could stand solid on their own. The scientific explanation came first, an illusion, they said. Shallow prints and degraded emulsion could deceive the eye. Maybe what looked like footprints were mere surface distortions. But Vernine had already ruled that out. The emulsion's stable, he said to the committee during an earlier session. Chemical degradation would affect tone, clarity, and layering. This doesn't have any of that. And the ground, look at the grass beneath the boots. Untouched. That's not how mud reacts to weight. The second, more popular among the town elders, was the procedural theory. A hoax. Some sort of prank, or worse, a staged fraud for attention. Perhaps the figure was inserted after the exposure, printed over an existing landscape image. Then tell me, Vernon had challenged them, voice low and deliberate, how the man's stance lines up perfectly with the boot prints, spacing, width, even lean, not an inch off. Either the hoaxer knew geometry better than God, or the man in the picture was really there. But why no trail? Someone whispered. Why only 6 prints, and nothing behind? The question hung in the air like smoke. Crestwell didn't sleep that night. He tossed in the museum's upstairs cot, haunted by the plate's ghostly figure. Something about the man's posture unsettled him. Not the face, which remained blank and featureless in the grain, but the angle of his stance. It leaned slightly forward as if bracing against a wind that hadn't yet arrived. And then there was the third theory, the one no one said out loud until a minister's son from Halebridge finally gave it shape. What if he came into the world, not from it? At first, laughter had met the suggestion. Nervous, brittle laughter. But then came the details they couldn't explain away. The man's shadow, subtle, yes, but discernible, tilted unnaturally forward despite the sun's westward position, breaking the expected angle of lightfall. The stitching on the coat, too intricate, the thread too tight. Tailors from Bangor to Millinocket had been consulted, and none claimed the fabric or the cut. "No seam like that has come through my shop," said Harold Frint, a master tailor who had serviced judges and governors alike. Looks foreign, but not foreign like France or Prussia. Foreign like, not from a loom. A sample sketch of the coat had been sent to the State Archive in Augusta, where textile historian Myron Keats confirmed, "This pattern isn't catalogued." Not in New England, not anywhere. The man's hat, wide-brimmed and curved slightly upward at the back, bore no maker's mark, though a faint imprint of something, possibly a symbol or crest, had been observed beneath the rim, eroded as if scrubbed off. Vernin, upon examining it, called the imprint unreadable but intentional, like someone erased its meaning without erasing its shape. A final detail came from Barrow's widow, Margaret, in a brittle note she penned before her death in 1908. Found among her Bible pages, it read simply, "He stood outside the edge of things." That's why Edwin burned the second plate Vernon had only learned of the second plate days before Margaret's funeral. No one knew what it showed. Some speculated it was a wider shot, perhaps one revealing more of the field. Others believed it may have shown the man moving, but no one ever found it. In the years that followed, the photograph passed from archive to archive. Debate churned, but clarity never surfaced. Theories rose and fell like tides, each trying to explain the impossible in terms the world could accept. But none could match the certainty of what the plate showed. Not a trick, not a flaw, not a mistake. Just a man who stood at the end of 6 perfect footprints and never took a single step. There is no known tailor who claimed the fabric, nor any man who matched his face. The envelope cracked open with a brittle whisper. Paul Hensley, barely 3 months into his archival appointment at the Bartram County Museum, hadn't expected anything unusual during his afternoon audit. His gloves trembled slightly as he unsealed the aged paper, labeled in faint blocky lettering, BARROWGLASSNEGATIVEUNCLAIMED. It had been tucked at the back of a drawer in the lower-level acquisitions cabinet, a place reserved for relics nobody knew what to do with. Inside, he found a folded note sealed with wax, a faded catalog card, and, wrapped in layers of linen and brittle straw, a glass plate photograph. He unwrapped it with slow, deliberate movements. That was when the lights flickered. Paul looked up. The ceiling fixtures dimmed once, twice, and then every bulb in the east wing snapped off with a sharp pop, plunging the archive room into sudden darkness. The climate control units sighed to a halt. Silence followed, broken only by the soft creak of expanding pipes and the thump of Paul's own heartbeat. He stood frozen, the negative still cradled in his hands. Then he felt it. Warmth. Not from the air, the plate itself. A steady, unnatural heat radiated from the center of the glass. His hands tightened involuntarily. The warmth wasn't painful, but unsettling. Wrong. Like holding something that had no right to pulse like a living thing. And then came the sound. Not external, but internal. A low hum that seemed to vibrate inside Paul's skull, like wind moving through wires stretched tight across a deep chasm. His breath hitched. He whispered aloud, without meaning to, "What the hell is this?" There was no reply, only the quiet pressure of a room that suddenly felt occupied. Paul placed the plate gently back on the table and stumbled toward the hallway. Emergency backup lighting glowed red near the exit, casting long, sharp shadows against the concrete floor. When he reached the power panel and called upstairs, the report was the same. No storms, no blown circuits, no tripped breakers. And yet the entire east wing was out. At 3:17 a.m. that night, the East Hall's grandfather clock, a carved oak relic donated in 1894, stopped ticking. Its brass pendulum halted mid-swing, frozen between seconds. Later reviews of the security feed showed nothing. No intrusions, no movement. But the next morning, when Paul returned with the head curator, they found a faint smear on the inside of the sealed display case. It was shaped like a boot print, broad, shallow, left heel angled outward. Dust had shifted along the edges, as if something had pressed there from within, and then vanished. The glass plate, now labeled Exposure Unverified Origin, was quietly relocated to deep storage, beneath the museum's foundation level in a nitrogen-cooled vault. No public announcement was made. Paul never touched the negative again. Years passed. In 2019, during a digitization effort funded by the Ellington Historical Archive Initiative, the negative was scanned by a remote technician named Derek Lowe. The scan was routine, flattened exposure, high-resolution pass-through, histogram correction. No anomalies were detected at first, but that night 6 users reviewing the uploaded file submitted identical feedback. Subject's eyes appear open. The original photograph, archived in both the museum's microfilm and nitrate records, showed the figure with eyelids closed, head tilted slightly downward, peaceful, but in the digital scan, his eyes were open, just barely. Thin, dark irises visible beneath the brow. Some claimed it was a rendering glitch. Others blamed AI upscaling, light leaks, pareidolia. But one technician noted that the pupils, however faint, seemed to be looking directly at the lens. Paul Hensley, now retired, refused to comment when contacted. His only written statement, filed in an internal memo, was a single line. How do footprints arrive before the walker, unless something else walked first? Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores mystery, time, and the thin veil between the seen and the unseen. Its purpose is to spark imagination, provoke curiosity, and remind us that some moments in history still refuse to be explained.